In the previous episode, we began Book 3 of The Gay Science, which marks a new beginning in the text because so much of the first two books could be seen as a preliminary. They could be seen as the preliminary chapters of the text, so to speak, and even the first sections of Book 3 that we went over last time can be seen as preparatory for the rest of Book 3. Those initial aphorisms in this book were on science and on the philosophy of science, we might say physics and metaphysics, Nietzsche's epistemological critique against scientific positivism or objectivism, whatever we want to call it, the shadow of God on scientific thought, which makes scientific thought another form of Platonism. But now Nietzsche apparently pivots to morality. But I want to point out at the beginning here how undergirding that focus is still the centrality of epistemology, how we know what we know, and this is all a very important backdrop for some of the claims that Nietzsche will make about morality, beginning in section 114. So let's get into it. Quote, "How far the moral sphere extends. As soon as we see a new image, we immediately construct it with the aid of all our previous experiences, depending on the degree of our honesty and justice. All experiences are moral experiences, even in the realm of sense perception." End quote. So this is why the preliminary sections on Nietzsche's approach to epistemology and his approach to science are so critical, because that takes us to the foundations of his perspectivism. One could easily misconstrue Nietzsche's perspectivism as reducing to the fact that people simply have different opinions, informed by a different set of facts or experiences. But Nietzsche's perspectival turn goes much deeper than that. He would hold that even the facts we perceive are inseparable from perspective. Even our designations, our standards for what constitutes a fact. Because again, when we designate an object or an event, when we abstract a phenomenon from the rest of reality, we're drawing an arbitrary line where the analysis stops, or else the analysis would expand to encompass the whole of reality. So what does Nietzsche say here about the representation of images? When we make such a representation, we're constructing an image based on our previous experiences. And let me give an example of this. Your field of vision, what your brain sees when you look around the room, is not even in majority based on new sense impressions. In fact, the raw visual data that your brain receives, if it were fed to you directly, would be useless, because for one, the image taken through the lens of your eye is inverted. It's obscured by veins. It's full of holes from all the wear and tear on your eyes. The brain sort of cleans all of that off. It scrubs the image the way a photo editing program might do. And then further, especially when you're in a familiar place or seeing a familiar scene, your brain doesn't have to take in new sense data and recreate the scene from scratch. It uses what it already knows to fill in the gaps. And the experiments done by Solomon Asch on memory are also interesting here. He would show his subjects a short video and then question them about it. He might ask, how fast did the blonde drive past the farmhouse in her red convertible? And in the 10-second video that they just saw, actually a brunette is driving a blue convertible, and she didn't pass a farmhouse, she passed a barn, something of that nature. And people would strain to figure out how fast the vehicle must have been going, because he would tell them it's a psychological test about the subject's ability to intuit velocity or something like that. And then when they were re-shown the video, sometimes the subjects wouldn't even believe that it was the same footage, that their memory had been, in that short period of time, adjusted based on expectations that they'd taken on, and taken on as implicit premises of the questioning. And when we consider how this post hoc editing, or omission, or even embellishment is occurring in our memory all the time as a result of life experiences you're having now, or conversations you're having now, new implicit assumptions or expectations that you've taken on since then, we'd have to conclude that the way we represent the world in memory is always subject to fallibility, human fallibility. And so it seems that memory is not always honest. It may even be the rule that memory is dishonest. But we have to ask, isn't all representing a form of remembering? Because the representation is itself a response to an initial sense input. It's always a reaction to some external force. And that force could be light particles hitting the eye or sound waves striking the eardrum. Representation is what mediates, what comes between us and a direct experience of reality. The senses, right? So by the time a collection of sensations becomes represented into an experience, Nietzsche says, by then, all such experiences are moral experiences. And why is that? Because perception and representation themselves are based on how honest and just we're going to be. And in context, what does this mean? Well, honest, whether the representation is an embellishment or contains omissions, right? Or whether it does not do that. Just, whether we're truly representing everything within the field of sensation or being selective, arbitrary, and thus unjust. And we know for a fact, the brain does not represent every sensation equally. I mean, familiar sensations, again, are ignored or filled in as background noise. The same way a change in the level of light in your environment will be noticeable at first, but then your eyes will adjust. Or the ways you don't notice details of your surroundings that you've seen 1,000 times. Or just in the fact that the sensations of pain or pleasure or sensations that cause some form of excitement or anxiety, that's going to be more central to the experience that you represent than whatever's going on in the background of that experience. I was once stung by a man-o-war, and I'm pretty sure it was already dead, but its tendrils wrapped around my legs when I was swimming at the beach. And it was I don't think it was a riptide, but it was a particularly kind of violent tide that day. And if someone were to ask me, well, what do you remember about that day, right? Well, I remember the experience of being stung by a man-o-war because it hurt very, very badly. I don't remember anything else about that day. The other details of that experience, all the benign or neutral things that I might have taken in the sense data of, that simply didn't get recorded or represented in that way. I'm sure I saw plenty of things. I'm sure lots of collections of light particles hit my eye, and my eye registered objects of people and animals and the shape of the waves and cars passing by. But do I remember any of that? No, it's a blur. So our experience isn't just, quote unquote. When we experience things, it's not a perfect recording device that is taking in everything equally. It takes in what is relevant to me, relevant to my physiology or to my interests or my survival or whatever. The rest is all discarded. And so our experiences are, in that way, moral experiences, because judgment always has to be made and how the experience is constructed. And sometimes this is done consciously, but Nietzsche would say it's always happening unconsciously, that our physiology is judging what is relevant. We don't take in the whole of everything, the whole of sensation, right? What we designate as definitive of our experience is arbitrary. And again, that could be based on self-interest, it could be based on worldview, it could be based on a moral aim, either our own or shared by others. The fundamental point is that values decide here, too. And perhaps a great companion passage to this one in the Gay Science can be found in Nietzsche's notes. This is in Will to Power 505. Quote, "Our perceptions, as we understand them, i.e. the sum of all those perceptions, the becoming conscious of which was useful and essential to us and to the entire organic process, therefore not all perceptions in general, e.g. not the electric. This means we have senses for only a selection of perceptions, those with which we have to concern ourselves in order to preserve ourselves. Consciousness is present only to the extent that consciousness is useful. It cannot be doubted that all sense perceptions are permeated with value judgments, useful and harmful, consequently pleasant or unpleasant." End quote. So our entire construction of the world, of reality, is built on this foundation of value judgments. The reason why we have sensations in the first place is because of a value judgment. What we sense is related to what was essential for the organism. What was not essential was discarded or just simply never developed as a form of sensation. So we don't sense the electrical field, is the example that Nietzsche gives. But we do sense light particles. Is the world that we represent to ourselves based on the sense impression of light particles closer to a quote-unquote objective reality than a world constructed from an organism that didn't sense light particles, but perhaps only sense the electrical field? Well, it would be an absurd claim to say that one of those is closer to objective reality than the other one. But that means that this entire world that is represented from data from the five senses is based on that same principle of selection, judging and selecting which sensations are relevant. That's a biological process. And if your conclusion from this is that the true world has returned, because we're separating the biological construction of the world from the world as it, quote, actually is, remember what Nietzsche says in The Twilight of Idols. The senses don't lie to us. The senses don't lie at all. The true world is the world of the senses. But here we see the world of the senses is inextricably a world constructed from value judgments. So the conclusion for Nietzsche is not to try and escape from a world crafted by value judgments, just like the answer to the problem of moral relativism is not to embrace nihilism. But if we accept the phenomenal world as a world laced with valuations from the very start, what Nietzsche is drawing attention to here is just how radical that proposition is. There are no neutral experiences. There's no disinterested representation of reality. All of it, all perception is moral, which is to say judging, affirming, or negating in this context. And that's because, seen from this angle, life itself is moral. The values of an organism constitute the basis of its quote-unquote morality, and we're no different in that respect from any organism. So let's move on to 115. This is entitled The Four Errors. For the sake of clarity, if you've read the passage The Four Great Errors in Twilight of Idols, it's a totally different set of errors in that passage. Totally different passage written 5 years or so later that lists off four different errors from the ones here. So no relation between these two passages. So this is 115, quote, The Four Errors. Man has been educated by his errors. First, he always saw himself only incompletely. Second, he endowed himself with fictitious attributes. Third, he placed himself in a false order of rank in relation to animals in nature. Fourth, he invented ever new tables of goods and always accepted them for a time as eternal and unconditional. As a result of this, now one and now another human impulse and state held first place and was ennobled because it was esteemed so highly. If we removed the effects of these four errors, we should also remove humanity, humaneness, and, quote, human dignity, end quote. So the first sentence, man has been educated by his errors. I would probably spend a little more time in this if Nietzsche hadn't already thoroughly explained what he means, not only in books 1 and 2, but also in the sections we covered in the previous episode, the sections at the beginning of book 3, which discuss that the indispensability of our errors, right? The fact that we find error necessary. And in those sections, those errors that he lists, they include the idea that objects have substance, that things have some essential identity, as well as the numerification of the world, cause and effect, so on and so forth. And he doesn't mean things like, oh, Christian superstition helped people behave well, so that was a life-affirming error. I mean, that is a conclusion you could come to by reading Nietzsche, maybe not with Christianity, but some sort of religious enchantment of the world is necessary for life. But that isn't exactly what he means here. He means more fundamental judgments, judgments about the nature of reality. So let's look at these fundamental errors in 115. First, the human being sees himself incompletely. What does that mean? Well, for one, that we live in a conscious world, quote unquote. Consciousness is like a lone spotlight on a vast dark sea of unconsciousness. And Nietzsche would argue that the unconsciousness is where most of the self can be found. The drives behind our actions and our character are found in impulse. And these impulses are never or only rarely brought into the light of consciousness. The vast majority of the time, they're not in consciousness. We also see our history and our origins incompletely, either by covering over those origins with myth and religion or by prioritizing recent history, looking at the last couple decades under American democracy and saying that characterizes the human condition, or the last few hundred years under the Enlightenment, or the last couple thousand years under Christianity, or even the 6,000 years of civilization. or, we can argue about where that line should be drawn. Those are all incomplete accountings of the human being who spent millions of years in what we might call the state of nature, even though it isn't really a state, and man never lived solitary and alone, as Hobbes characterized it. But you get the idea. That was our domain, our habitat for so long. So we see ourselves incompletely in many respects, not just on the level of consciousness, but in terms of our understanding of the human condition generally. Second, mankind gives himself false attributes. And here, I think Nietzsche is thinking of things like free will, which is part and parcel with the ability to separate the doer from the deed, to intercede between impulse and action. We might say that's the creation of the ego consciousness, and this goes all the way back to Plato and his tripartite self. Or we could think of faculties, the faculty for knowing, synthetic judgments a priori. These are fictitious attributes, in Nietzsche's view, that we have attributed to mankind. Third, humanity places itself in a false order of rank in relation to nature. So man is the pinnacle of nature. We have dominion over the animals and so on and so forth. Or, we're a thing that escapes nature. We escape the food chain, or however we want to call it. We transcend our biology. And we make this division between natural and man-made, which is a false dichotomy. And whether the explanation given is that we're, for why we're separate from all the animals is that we're a thing with a soul, which the other animals don't have, or maybe just this sort of implicit prejudice that we're the goal, we're the completion of the project of evolution. Both of these are errors. Both are a false relation to nature. And then finally, the last of these errors that he lists is that we take our values, which are perspectival and contingent, and we universalize them. These valuations, these judgments, at bottom are rooted in an impulse, and Nietzsche says that through these valuations, some impulse or another was effectively ennobled and deified for a time. Whenever the valuations, the judgments of that particular impulse are held to be of the highest esteem, the highest good under some table of value, they were attributed a universal importance. So we could say that one of the main problems, one of the main mistakes that colors this type of reasoning that Nietzsche describes is reasoning from what is perceptible from one perspective, one vantage point, or with a certain set of limited information, and extrapolating this into an explanation for, or a value judgment on, the whole thing. So from our incomplete view of the self, we make all these claims about ourselves or about human nature generally. But there's something more going on here. That's one part of some of these errors, maybe the first one and the last one mainly. But the false attributes we give to ourselves or imagine ourselves to have, that doesn't come from incomplete information, but from the willingness to, quite frankly, be false, to engage in flights of fancy of the conscious apparatus, to embellish. And the clue, I think the key to all this is what Nietzsche says at the end. Without these errors, there'd be no human dignity, no sense of the value of humanity, or even what humanity is. So what are we doing? Well, once again, an impulse is esteeming itself. Once again, we're making perceptions based on judgments that we have made and deemed necessary, which at their root are unjust, are dishonest, but without these errors, humanity appears a small and insignificant thing. No longer the ruler of nature, one of many forces contesting within nature instead. And therefore, we have to make this error. That's how our intellect proceeds, not by a sober attempt to comprehend raw facts, whatever such a statement would even mean, if even such a thing is even imaginable. Because, again, it's not even clear that we have quote-unquote facts independent of value judgment. And we might even go so far as to say that if previous species that were the apex predator could think to the degree that we do, they would make all of the same false judgments about the value and fictitious attributes of themselves, right? If the dinosaurs could philosophize, they would make many of these same errors because in some way it's natural to esteem what you are and to seek to uplift and preserve and elevate the type that you represent, the way of life that you live. That's all very normal. And so there's this sort of Janus face with Nietzsche that is one of the fundamental sort of paradoxes that many people struggle with in his work. And it's something you should struggle with. It's not something to neatly untangle. That these perspectival, relative, contingent value judgments are something that you have to engage in. And the norm is to take that and universalize it and call it an absolute. And so we philosophers and free spirits can look at this and say, you're positing this as an absolute when it's actually perspectival and contingent and relative. And yet we can see how that absolutism really just sort of represents a conviction and esteeming of oneself, an esteeming of one's own way of life. And it might be profoundly unhealthy to say, it would be like if I often talk about the good of the lion and the good of the gazelle, what is good for each of them. That seems very apropos in relation to this aphorism. It would be like if the gazelle laid down and said, what use is it fighting the lion? Of course, the lion thinks it's, what if a gazelle were to philosophize and come to that insight that we have these two mutually exclusive goods or versions of what the good life is, that we have no choice as organisms but to affirm the way we are. So I can't blame the lion. I'm just going to lay down here and let myself be eaten, right? That's the eternal problem, is that it's why Nietzsche kind of struggles with nihilism, because this insight could lead to the embrace of nihilism. And Nietzsche doesn't think that that's the correct view. We have to judge. We have to assess value. We have to be arbitrary and unjust. And so you could say that the real challenge is how to understand the perspectival and relative nature of your value judgments and still assert them absolutely in some sense. That's the real challenge, I think, or one of the many deep challenges that Nietzsche poses to us. Takes us a little beyond the scope of the passage, but in any case, let's move on. This is 116, quote, "Herd instinct. Whenever we encounter a morality, we also encounter valuations in an order of rank of human impulses and actions. These valuations and orders of rank are always expressions of the needs of a community and herd. Whatever benefits it most, and second most, and third most, that is also considered the first standard for the value of all individuals. Morality trains the individual to be a function of the herd and to ascribe value to himself only as a function. The conditions for the preservation of different communities were very different. Hence, there were very different moralities. Considering essential changes in the forms of future herds and communities, states, and societies, we can prophesy that there will yet be very divergent moralities. Morality is herd instinct in the individual." End quote. So that section ends with one of the most infamous and quotable lines in all of Nietzsche's canon. By now, if you've been following along with the podcast for a while, or even just the walkthrough of this book, or if you have a general grasp of the core concepts of Nietzsche, I think this passage is fairly simple to untangle, but we'll just go through and constellate all the core concepts as they appear here. So, valuations, physiological demands for the prioritization or preservation of a definite mode of existence. Basically what we were just talking about. Each organism and the value judgments that are at root physiological. They're really prejudgments. These determinations are made on the level of biology by the organism, even when it comes to what is perceived. And then, with conscious animals like ourselves, this can be expressed on a more sophisticated level. I mean, it can go so far as an articulated, complex morality, a table of values. Nietzsche invokes the order of rank. What does that mean in this context? Literally, rank ordering. Nietzsche says, what benefits the community the most? What benefits it second most, third most, so on and so forth. And obviously you might say, well, what does it mean to say something, quote unquote, benefits the community. And we might say a deeper level to this is that too is a value judgment. So we might say you have to establish an order of rank for that as well, for what benefit means, different understandings of benefiting, how they stand in relation to each other. All of this is mostly going on unconsciously, Nietzsche would say, over long generations and through experimentation and so on and so forth. But this concept of the order of rank, it really is central to what Nietzsche sees as the root of reasoning, which is suffused with value judgments. The key point in the passage is something Nietzsche has raised in this book already, but he says it perhaps most explicitly here. What we call morality, quote unquote, in the broad sense of the term, generally refers to the social consensus on what is moral. So, yeah, people have their own personal codes of morals. They have their own set of principles or virtues, or some people do. But at the end of the day, what is considered moral or immoral, especially throughout history, was what society at large considered moral or immoral. This was according to usually a founding religious text or a law book, or simply according to conventions that are adopted and tested and eventually believed in as universal moral codes, because of that same dynamic that Nietzsche describes in the previous section. And I guess another detail in the passage is Nietzsche simply says, different peoples face different challenges. Maybe they're constituted by a different set of impulses. Maybe they find different impulses have different results owing to their situation than other communities would. So each collective, each social structure creates its own different morality, which at bottom, that means a different rank ordering of the value or benefit of different impulses and actions, and their value and benefit to what? The whole society, the whole collective. These are what are called herds in Nietzsche's terminology. And so the individual is brought up to ascribe himself value as a function of the herd, as its instrument, as a tool of serving the benefit of the collective. This is the selfishness which is inherent in all apparently selfless moralities. Because, and this is a point Nietzsche raised earlier in the book, by teaching the constituent individuals to be selfless, the herd benefits itself in totality. So the greatest number, the great majority of people, the collective in toto, is benefited by the moralities of selflessness. So it's actually self-interested to promote selflessness, not self-interested for the individual, but at the level of the herd. And that's a really important point, I think. The herd has genuine power. This is often ignored or discarded by some immature readings of Nietzsche. The primary unit of human existence has never been the individual. So, if you take from Nietzsche that might makes right, which is also not really a correct reading, because might makes might. It's not about right for Nietzsche. It's not about right at all. But if your whole ideology just becomes, okay, it's all about power and that's all I care about, well then the herd is the most powerful thing. The herd, there's that really funny passage in Will to Power where Nietzsche says that the weak are stronger than the strong because of not just the numerical advantage, but just the advantage of the power of consciousness, because the consciousness really belongs to them, to the collective. And the individual, however lauded he may be within our current sort of social zeitgeist, that's something of a new invention. I mean, most human societies are not premised on an individual, not on the worth of the individual or even really the existence of the individual, because the individual does not exist individually. Man's never lived that way. We don't spring into being out of the ether. The herd has power to determine the order of rank of values. We might say the value of values, which is what a table of values really is, precisely because it has real power. It has physical power, and that translates into cultural power, social power, power over the mind. And this comes from the fact the individual constituents are dependent on it. They're dependent on the herd. The herd exercises its power to make those dependents ascribe to the morality that benefits the total unit, not the individual. And so human history can be seen as a series of herds with different divergent moralities, all of which spring from those fundamental valuations about what benefits their herd, not the individual as such. And these herds sometimes cooperate and they sometimes contest with one another, but ultimately those divisions between cultures or between civilizations are actually divisions between different determinations made about the value of values on the group level. And finally, the last line here in this section is morality as the herd instinct in the individual. So we've all inherited a herd instinct because we descend from people who have lived for uncounted generations within herds. And so when we feel the pangs of conscience, that's the herd trying to turn us into a function. You ought to behave this way. And sometimes one can even feel this so deeply that it's the most real feeling imaginable. And Nietzsche argues that, of course, it would be. The instincts that have been most deeply nurtured and developed will be experienced as more real than anything else. And furthermore, even when a philosopher tries to come along and do metaethics, when Kant or Hegel or Schopenhauer show up and they produce this complicated, abstruse, consciously articulated philosophy that comes to moral conclusions about how mankind should act, they almost always end up mirroring the moral prejudices that they already hold, which end up referring back to the morality of the herd, to the herd instinct, because we ultimately check our conclusions, even in philosophy, against what feels right. And, like what rings true to us, quote unquote. And I've brought that point up before, but I think it's just so important that philosophers can say whatever they want, but unless it resonates with you, unless it feels right on some level, all the logic in the world can't overcome that. Once again, feelings don't care about your facts. Now, compare this to the previous section, the 4 errors. Morality is rooted in all of these errors. The extrapolation from the incomplete to claims about the whole, creative embellishment for the sake of promoting what's beneficial. And if we consider the section previous to that one, the first one we looked at today, morality has been determined already at the physiology level. We might say prejudged, so it's a prejudice. But importantly also, something I haven't really brought up in my analysis that kind of is also there throughout this whole passage, morality is a process. The fact that Nietzsche says we can predict more divergent moralities in the future necessarily means that the moral instinct is moving, it's developing. It doesn't come from a series of bedrock first principles, accessible at any time or place. So even what the individual feels to be beyond question, what feels right, what our conscience tells us, could be different for different peoples. What it always refers back to is the good of the herd. And that's why, as a final note on this passage, it's useful to understand the multiple uses of the word morality in Nietzsche's work, the multiple senses of the term, because, of course, one can have their personal morality, as I mentioned before. You can also talk about morality as a discipline, like the study of how humans ought to act. But here he means morality as a phenomenon in human life and thought. Really, he means morality the way it's experienced. And so when he talks about moralists versus we immoralists, this is really what he means. An immoralist can have his own moral theories. He can have his own morality. But you're always an immoralist if you're unwilling to go along with, or even just simply unconcerned with, the moral axioms that refer back to the good of the collective. If you defy the herd instinct, that's really what it means to be an immoralist. And so a very radical passage just in sum when we consider that Nietzsche is reducing morality to impulse, all of it, which normally, I guess you would say in classical moral theories and even in Enlightenment moral theories, I mean, there's very few exceptions. Maybe David Hume, right, would be one of them. Most of the time, morality is seen as that which restrains impulse. But Nietzsche takes morality and turns it into a product of impulse. Let's go to 117. Quote, herd remorse. During the longest and most remote periods of the human past, the sting of conscience was not at all what it is today. One feels responsible only for one's will and actions, and one finds one's pride in oneself. All our teachers of law start from this sense of self and pleasure in the individual as if this had always been the fount of law. But during the longest period of the human past, nothing was more terrible than to feel that one stood by oneself, to be alone, to experience things by oneself, neither to obey nor to rule, to be an individual. That was not a pleasure but a punishment. One was sentenced to individuality. Freedom of thought was considered discomfort itself. While we experienced law and submission as a compulsion and loss, it was egoism that was formerly experienced as something painful and as real misery. To be a self and to esteem oneself according to one's own weight and measure, that offended taste in those days. An inclination to do this would have been considered madness, for being alone was associated with every misery and fear. In those days, free will was very closely associated with a bad conscience, and the more unfree one's actions were, and the more the herd instinct, rather than any personal sense, found expression in an action, the more moral one felt. Whatever harmed the herd, whether the individual had wanted it or not wanted it, prompted the sting of conscience in the individual, and in his neighbor too, and even in the whole herd. There is no point on which we have learned to think and feel more differently." End quote. So, in our analysis of even the previous section, we touched on this idea already. But this is the beginning of Nietzsche's exploration of bad conscience, understanding the sting of conscience as something learned rather than innate, which means it can also be unlearned. And again, within Christianity, and I would say even within popular moral prejudices today, we still tend to look at, well, what does your heart tell you, though? Oh, you can rationalize all your behavior, but at the end of the day, your conscience will tell you what's right and wrong. And in Christianity, this had a metaphysical explanation. That's the moral law that God wrote on your heart, right? And even people who don't believe in that, and the superstitious explanation of that, still believe there's sort of a moral law written on the human heart. But if the moral conscience is learned, and it can be unlearned, then what implications would that have? And perhaps we'll see those implications by contrast, because we're in the process of unlearning it, of unlearning the herd instinct, at least on this fundamental point, at least to the extent that Nietzsche says, we've learned to think and feel differently today. On no point of divergence between ancient and modern morality is there a wider gulf than the way that we feel about the value of individual thought versus that of the ancients, who didn't value individual thought whatsoever. Free will, freedom of thought, freedom of action, all of that in itself was bad conscience. It might as well have been synonymous with those things. A helpful passage to cross-reference here is the one outlining the three moral ages found in Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche's making assertions in that passage about the character of the pre-moral age, as he calls it, the longest period of human history. You might call it moral thinking, but it's not moral in the sense that we think of it today. In this model, the valuations don't take into account one's intentions or one's free will. It was a simple calculation backwards from the effect of your actions to the value of your action, or even of you as a person, or even the actions of your offspring calculated back to the value of you. And in this way, it's a simple consequentialism. We might even call it correspondence thinking. Something bad happens as a result of what you did, therefore you're bad, regardless of what you intended, or even the true cause of what happened, right? The morality of these earlier periods is based primarily on taboo, on ritual, on the repetition of established rites, of conventional behaviors and acts. And that all was sort of determined by your ancestors, by the ancients, as being that which preserved the herd, accurately or not. That's what they believed. And so your individual free thinking about any of this, at best, it's irrelevant. At worst, it's a danger, right? So let's think about one of these like ritual or taboo ideas. So somebody who wanted to think freely about whether the Vestal fires of ancient Rome actually preserved the city. Let's do an experiment. Let's put out the fires and see what actually happens. to the average Roman, that's a dangerous and immoral person. Even raising the prospect of that would be repugnant. It could probably get you in serious trouble, actually. This is probably on my mind because I just talked about this topic with Gnostic informant. But, the idea of experimentation, testing, using my individual reason to go against what the conventional wisdom tells me or what we've all agreed on, again, accurately or not, that is dangerous and immoral. It's evil. It's impious. We should also recall earlier in The Gay Science, where Nietzsche discusses how even the act of thinking had to be hard won. So for us, thinking comes easily. It occurs while we're going about our day. Thoughts are always chiming in. But Nietzsche imagines that in past times, perhaps people actually had to stop and concentrate in order to think. That the act of summoning or conjuring even a single thought might have required time and effort and undivided attention and concentration. So we might imagine that most of the thinking that's gone on has been, to put it one way, herd thinking. So guided by the physiological prejudgments of what is beneficial to the collective at large, our feelings push our thought into certain channels according to prejudicial moral designations or moral rank orderings. And that thinking has really occurred on a collective level, so to speak, and that having an individual thought, a thought that is not tempered and tested by what benefits the collective, a thought that's not guided according to what's popularly believed to benefit the collective. The value of that kind of thought was discarded or even opposed, and whenever that type of thought was expressed, the thinker was chastised. We might think of another passage I've referenced many times, but which occurs in Book 5 of The Gay Science, so we'll get there eventually, about the utility of consciousness as a tool of communication between individuals. Its usefulness on the level of survivability is not really related to the individual intellect's ability to construct an honest or objective picture of the world or something like that, whatever we want to say. The reason why we have consciousness is really as a net of communication. And Nietzsche says for relaying commands across a collective of minds. That's where consciousness attains its power. And we might recall from that note in Will to Power that we quoted at the beginning of this episode where Nietzsche says, quote, consciousness is present only to the extent that consciousness is useful, end quote. And so that leads us to the conclusion that if consciousness is primarily useful for communication, then it has only really been present to the extent that it serves that function. So the entire history of individual thought has been cutting against the grain of thinking itself in some fundamental way. And so the capacity we now have for individual thought, for immoral thought, is an incredible thing. It's an aberration, really. Perhaps from the perspective of the herd or the species, maybe it's a mistake. But again, we have been educated by our errors. So some of the greatest things about human existence and the development of humankind can be seen as mistakes in their origin. So let's go to 118. Quote, benevolence. Is it virtuous when a cell transforms itself into a function of a stronger cell? It has no alternative. And is it evil when the stronger cell assimilates the weaker? It also has no alternative. It follows necessity, for it strives for superabundant substitutes and wants to regenerate itself. Hence, we should make a distinction in benevolence between the impulse to appropriate and the impulse to submit, and ask whether it is the stronger or the weaker that feels benevolent. Joy and desire appear together in the stronger that wants to transform something into a function. Joy and the wish to be desired appear together in the weaker that wants to become a function. Pity is essentially of the former type, an agreeable impulse of the instinct for appropriation at the sight of what is weaker. But it should be kept in mind that strong and weak are relative concepts. End quote. There's a lot here in a very relatively short passage. And on the surface level, Nietzsche is just sort of raising this point about whether, is it truly more benevolent to accept becoming a function, becoming assimilated to a stronger force, than it is to be the stronger force that does the appropriating and the assimilating. That joy and desire could take place on either level, either on the stronger or the weaker force. And he's talking about cells, but obviously you can extrapolate from that into exactly what we've been talking about in the previous aphorisms of the individual making himself a function of the herd. But I think beginning on the level of cells is a very important level of analysis that informs Nietzsche's understanding of the will to power. It's a post-moral analysis. It doesn't establish a judge above the phenomena. It instead attempts to discern the perspective of each given phenomena, render the world according to that perspective. And we might say cells aren't conscious, so they don't really have wants and desires or pleasure or something like that. Nietzsche would say, quite the opposite. Maybe they don't have a conscious experience of it the way that you do, but a cell in some way is just pure impulse, which is pure desire, pure pleasure and pain. That's the totality of its existence. It's not representing the world with all of these sense impressions into this constructed, false, mendacious world of consciousness. It's just purely living an impulse. It's just purely stimulus response, or desire and object of its desire, whatever we might want to say about it. But this ties back to the morality of the predator, or the perspective of the predator versus the perspective of the prey animal. And here Nietzsche treats the same issue from the perspective of the stronger cell assimilating a weaker one. That's the nature of his analysis of power relationships. When we break it down to the level of forces and understand the predator is its own force, so to speak, so are the cells making up the predator. Each of them is their own force in some way. There are tensions and relations of force at every single level of existence. Even calling them levels is sort of a falsification of the world, but these are just different lenses or perspectives at which to view reality. We can see all the more clearly when we look at it on the level of the cell. It's not a matter of good versus evil. This is a matter of something strong appropriating a lesser force which is weak and instrumentalizing it, making it a part of itself, making it into something that obeys. And while it might be considered a stretch to see everything in the world from that perspective, even though you certainly could, and there are times when Nietzsche does apply the will to power beyond just the category of living things, he applies it even to inanimate things. At least when it comes to the phenomenon of life, it seems clear. Reproduction and consumption are the two elements, so life depends on the superior force appropriating the lesser force. It's a fancy way of talking about eating. Whether that means literally eating, consuming the flesh of a prey animal, or a superior cell absorbing a smaller one, there's no evil in this process, unless we're going to say life is inherently evil. And conversely, it's not good, it's not virtuous when the lesser cell lets itself be instrumentalized, the way a member of a herd makes himself into its function, or the way some species of, what's a good example? Like a male spider might assent to being eaten by the female after mating so that she'll have enough nutrients and strength to take care of their offspring. In all cases, these are organisms acting to their predetermined values that, as Nietzsche says, follow necessity. That ultimately, if the weaker cell were conscious and had all sorts of ideas about the prospect of being absorbed or assimilated or appropriated by a stronger cell, whatever those ideas might be, none of it has really any bearing on the situation. It's the relative strength of the cells that is determinative. So this is amoral naturalism, we might say. And if you apply this to society at large, many would call that a naturalistic fallacy. But Nietzsche, again, is not saying something is good because it's natural. He's not making any value judgment about it at all. Now, the parties involved make their value judgments. Of course. Spinoza is really useful here. The individual modifications of nature, natura, which is substantially identical with God. So Spinoza is a pantheist, and he looks at the world of nature and says, we're all modes, we're modifications of God, all things. And they all have their good and evil. They all have their, from their relative perspective, what hurts them or harms them and what benefits them. And of course, they're committed to that. Like, they don't see it from the perspective of God, of the totality. But God, the totality of all those things, takes no part in the struggle. He doesn't have any conception of good or evil. He doesn't partake in this world of moral decisions and actions that we do. Or to the extent that he does, it's through the modes, through each limited perspective. Whereas from God's absolute perspective, there is no morality in that sense. Now, Nietzsche denies the absolute perspective, and he's certainly, I think he's very much inspired by the idea of Spinoza as regards perspectivism. It's Spinoza's perspectivism without that undergirding idea of the monistic substance of natura or God behind it, right? But from the perspective of an imagined neutral observer, all the value judgments made by all parties would be a reflection of what's necessary for them rather than an actual moral duty that they have to assent of out of their free will. And it's very easy to see that, again, on the level of cells, even on the level of the animal kingdom. It's necessity, the consumption of the lesser by the greater. That's what has to happen, according to the impulses of the organisms involved. But when we take things into the realm of mankind, where we have made this artificial division between man and nature, we begin to moralize the conflict, which, again, we can't live without those moralizations. We can't help but think in terms of these errors because it's indispensable for us and because the collective morality condemns us if we don't think in those terms. But there it is. When we change the scale of our analysis to the level of the cell, the stark amorality of nature stares us in the face. Now, what's really interesting in this passage, and it's a fairly new idea as far as this text is concerned, and that Nietzsche hasn't really brought it up before, the description of what pity is from this angle. Nietzsche has described pity before in previous works. He describes it from the side of being pitied, how it is and why it is that they are able to extract the feeling of pity from others. They do this because it's an expression of power to be pitied. When you inspire others to share in your pain, from a certain perspective, you could say you're hurting them, right? You're sharing your pain with them, which means that by being pitied, you experience the fact that you at least have the power to hurt still. At least you still have that power. Here Nietzsche tries to understand the impetus not to be pitied, but to pity. So he says, joy and desire appear in the stronger force that wants to transform something into a function. And pity is essentially what is at work in this process. So one transforms what is weaker than themselves into a function of themselves, and even does this with an agreeable feeling in the case of pity. What would be an example of this? Well, let's imagine a wealthy patron adopting a street urchin, and they raise them up out of this state of abject poverty, and they rescue them, right? They save them from poverty. And by that same act, perhaps they make them their ward or their dependent. So they transform something which was weak and destitute and revitalize them and save them and fix them. But now they're incorporated into maybe your household. They live under your power, so to speak. So even the act of revitalizing them, remaking them, right, on every level from their physical constitution to their aesthetic appearance, make them into a new person, in a way that's a demonstration of your power. That transformation was dependent on you and your actions. And so, seen from either angle, even pity, which would seem to be something which is entirely alien to Nietzsche's idea of the will to power, is explained under this framework. And the last line is very important too. Strong and weak are relative concepts. There's no absolute universal definition of strength. Even if we were to say, well, can't we just calculate strength in numerical terms, purely in terms of quantity? Well, aside from the problem that the numerification of the world is its falsification, I could see the argument. Let's just conceive of strength as greater power, weakness as lesser power. We can put a number on it. Even then, you can only speak in relative terms, though. You don't get out of that. And what I mean by this is, are you strong if you're able to lift 200 pounds? Well, yes, but not compared to someone who can lift 400 pounds, right? So are you strong in an absolute sense? Is Magnus Carlsen good at chess? Compared to every human on Earth, yes, he is. But compared to an engine, like Stockfish, he's exactly as weak and helpless as every other human being on Earth against that opponent. So there's no absolute definition of strength. There's no such thing as strength in itself. It only makes sense to talk of strength relative to a weaker force and vice versa. If we drew some arbitrary quantitative line and said, at this point you're strong, That can only ever be provisional because the situation is ever changing. It's always relative. And this is going to be very important a couple sections from now. So hold on to that point in your head about the, we might call it the absolute relativity of Nietzsche's view. But for now, let's go to 119. Quote, "No altruism. In many people, I find an overwhelmingly forceful and pleasurable desire to be a function. They have a very refined sense for all those places where precisely they could function and push in those directions. Examples include those women who transform themselves into some function of a man that happens to be underdeveloped in him, and thus become his purse, or his politics, or his sociability. Such beings preserve themselves best when they find a fitting place in another organism. If they fail to do this, they become grumpy, irritated, and devour themselves." End quote. So the first thing is the title, No Altruism. He doesn't mention altruism in the narrow sense, say in the sense of philanthropy or something like this. What he actually describes in the passage is a woman making herself a function of a man, taking on some aspect of his life that is underdeveloped. And that doesn't have to be limited to women, especially in modern times. I often notice this in couples, that one of them is just bad at something or just hates doing it, and the other partner just does it for them. They make themselves into a function of something underdeveloped in that person. Say, managing the finances, taking care of the housework, or whatever. Some couples try to share in these duties, but Nietzsche's pointing out there's actually something very pleasurable for many people in becoming a function. They like to feel useful. They like to be of service. And I think most of us will find within ourselves, maybe as a result of those herd instincts, that it is a good feeling, that it's akin to the cell being assimilated and absorbed by a stronger cell, and doing so while feeling virtuous. It's a good feeling. So Nietzsche is interpreting altruism here in the broad, extended sense, in the abstract, we might say, in the sense of being willing to do something apparently selflessly, entirely for the sake of others. And Nietzsche's saying, but it's not selfless. What's actually happening here is that you have an impulse that seeks pleasure through instrumentalizing yourself. We get pleasure from being quote-unquote altruistic. So it's not really for others, especially in the case where it's for someone we love or even a cause that we love. And a great passage to cross-reference in regard to this is from Human All Too Human number 57. Quote, "The girl in love wishes that she might prove the devoted faithfulness of her love through her lover's faithlessness. The soldier wishes that he might fall on the battlefield for his victorious fatherland, for in the victory of his fatherland, his greatest desire is also victorious. The mother gives the child what she takes from herself, sleep, the best food, in some instances even her health, her wealth. Are all these really selfless states? Isn't it clear that, in all these cases, man is loving something of himself, a thought, a longing, an offspring, more than something else of himself, that he is thus dividing up his being and sacrificing one part for the other?" End quote. So this could apply to any number of things other than romantic love. We instrumentalize ourselves in all sorts of ways. Again, probably because of the herd instinct. But notice, though, Nietzsche's framing of how this works is slightly different from both of these passages. In one case, he says that instrumentalizing ourselves, we're actually self-identifying with the thing that we're becoming the instrument of. And in the passage in The Gay Science, it's that we're gaining pleasure from fulfilling an impulse to self-instrumentalize. I think that both of these explanations can be seen as sketching in or filling in different aspects of this process, may be seen from a different angle. I guess the difference between them, the main difference would be Human All Too Human, Nietzsche's physiologism is not really fully developed yet. He does talk about instinct and impulse in that work, but it is much more on the level of cognition, his critique. Whereas The Gay Science, he has fully gone down to the physiological root. So when he talks about self-identification with the thing that you're becoming an instrument of, that's sort of on the level of cognition. Maybe it's like Nietzsche attempting to see what's going on unconsciously. It's very psychological, but it isn't quite physiological. I'll put it like that. Whereas the explanation in The Gay Sciences, he goes deeper and says there's actually an impulse to instrumentalize yourself. There's actually And what do all impulses sort of represent? A drive towards something and the sense of pleasure when that drive is fulfilled. So now let's go to 120. And I actually just read this one in my response to Abigail Thorne, which I think as this episode comes out, that will not be out yet. But I'll reference this again, I guess, when you see my response to the video that she did. We're going to look at this passage here in context with the rest of the gay science. So let's look at 120. Quote, "Health of the soul. The popular medical formulation of morality that goes back to Ariston of Chios, virtue is the health of the soul, would have to be changed to become useful, at least to read, your virtue is the health of your soul. For there is no health as such, and all attempts to define a thing that way have been wretched failures. Even the determination of what is healthy for your body depends on your goal, your horizon, your energies, your impulses, your errors, and above all on the ideals and phantasms of your soul. Thus there are innumerable healths of the body, and the more we allow the unique and incomparable to raise its head again, and the more we abjure the dogma of the equality of men, the more must the concept of a normal health, along with a normal diet and the normal course of an illness, be abandoned by medical men. Only then would the time have come to reflect on the health and illness of the soul, and to find the peculiar virtue of each man and the health of his soul. In one person, of course, this health could look like its opposite in another person. Finally, the great question would still remain whether we can really dispense with illness, even for the sake of our virtue, and whether our thirst for knowledge and self-knowledge in particular does not require the sick soul as much as the healthy, and whether, in brief, the will to health alone is not a prejudice, cowardice, and perhaps a bit of very subtle barbarism and backwardness." End quote. So the beginning of that passage talks about Ariston of Chios. He was a student of Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. So he says virtue is the health of the soul, and Nietzsche comments on that passage. What's implicit in that quotation from Ariston is that virtue is common to all men. That what it is that constitutes virtue is common to all. The Stoics would have held that. And to the Stoics, it's precisely adherence to that common virtue that makes one's soul healthy. So it's through, a virtuous action and virtuous character that your soul can become hardy. Your character becomes able to endure the changes and the tumults of your life. And you become capable of true wisdom in the Stoic view. But Nietzsche says, he should have said, your virtue is the health of your soul. And that's one of the idiosyncratic ways that Nietzsche understands virtue. I've compared him in the past to an ancient Greek virtue ethicist, but this nuance that he makes here in 120 is really what sets him apart from them, because they all attempted to enumerate virtues, which are, again, common to all, universal. And so Nietzsche often, on the other hand, invokes personal virtues or even unnamed virtues. That what constitutes virtue, Nietzsche understands it as a dynamis, a trait, a quality or power that one has that is unique to the individual. Or rather, the virtues that are most peculiar will be the best ones, and the virtues that are shared by the most people will be of the least value, to the point where you have some dynamis, some power, some virtue of your character that we don't even have a word for because no one else shares it, because the act of naming is premised on what is common. So where Ariston of Chios is talking about health of the soul attained through morality, Nietzsche reframes the discussion by speaking of health as such, like health in a physical sense, which comes out of physiology. So impulses, we're going back to that level. And so for those who are unique and unparalleled, they have their own energies, their own ideals. They even have their own errors, right? Which means their own virtues or their own vices. And what constitutes the health of one man constitutes illness for another. There's no universal standard of health for the same reason that there's no universal standard of strength. These are relative concerns. But a lot of people don't really get what relativity means, that you have to have that dichotomy, or you don't know what strength is until it's compared to weakness. You don't know what health is until it's compared to sickness. Health as such, just health, it doesn't really make sense to speak of it that way, which is why Nietzsche suggests at the end that we can't dispense with illness. We have to wonder if the urge to dispense with illness is a prejudice, and a mark of cowardice. We might say health abstracted away from relativity and perspective, just health as such. It's kind of a last man idea. In the same way that Nietzsche remarks that we would abolish pleasure if we tried to be rid of pain, we would end up abolishing health if we tried to rid ourselves of sickness as such. And further, we could also conclude the form that health takes it bears a deep relation to the sickness that it has to overcome. So in Nietzsche's case, his own attainment of health, his convalescence from a period of extreme sickness, what that represented was a refusal to let the sickness, which was unique to him, smother his zeal for life. I mean, of course, it probably wasn't literally unique to him, but it was his own battle to fight, right? It wasn't, the sickness that he experienced wasn't something common to all, and so the health that he experiences is not something common to all. And there's any number of examples, though, if we wanted to get to use examples that apply to more people. I mean, what's a good one? Well, alcoholics often attribute their recovery to hitting rock bottom, when at the nadir of their own personal struggle, their own personal cross to bear, we might say, that's where they find the impetus for recovery. And the ones who make a full recovery from the worst alcoholism are usually the best about getting their lives back together, right? It's the functional alcoholics who never have to reckon with the really harmful, destructive conclusions that drinking could lead them to. If they never have to reckon with all of that, they might never make such a recovery. And I don't just mean recovery into sobriety. I mean the kind of recovery where you make like a personality change, get your life together, transform your life in a positive way. You could argue that you're more likely to do that if you end up in the worst possible situation than if you're simply managing like a pathological or harmful habit that doesn't completely ruin your life, but it just sort of botches it in small ways every day. It just sort of deadens your life. It just sort of stunts you, right? But you never make an ultimate confrontation where it destroys you, right? And so this insight, I think it doesn't just apply physiologically. It has implications for Nietzsche's broader philosophy, and that Christianity is also a sickness, the way he talks about it. So if and when the Western world fully overcomes Christianity, that new great health that comes with overcoming this anti-life ideology will be in some way defined by or dependent on the Christianity that it had to overcome. And on the meta level, we could even say that this struggle between health and sickness, between stagnation and change, between the genome and the mutation, between the rule and the exception, that's the whole story of life. That's the advancement of life. It's what we call a productive tension. War is creative. That's the Heraclitean point of view. War as the father of all things. And this is true in the submolecular level, but it's also true on the level of cultural superstructures. Christianity versus the pagan ideal. That is the conflict that has brought about an immense tension of the soul, two value systems pulling in completely opposite directions, drawing the bow of the soul taut. And so this is the sense in which we require the sick soul as much as the healthy. We require even sickness for ourselves and the experience with sickness in order to overcome it. Not just in the sense of knowing what health is by contrast, but by the fact that health itself in the superordinate sense comes into being as a very result of the conflict. And so the will to health alone, health abstracted into something universal and absolute, that's a fictitious idea, it's a Platonic idea. It's cowardly because it flees into that intelligible world of forms. In actuality, health is, once again, conditional, it's relative, it's contingent, and it is unique. It's each instance of health is peculiar. And as a side point, I do want to bring up the argument I made in response to Abigail Thorne about the implications of this passage, the argument I made about the implications of this passage in my response to the Philosophy Tube video. Because when Nietzsche says that all our metaphysical ideas can be seen as the symptoms of certain bodies, that even an aptitude for philosophy itself might depend on your constitution, your makeup. Nietzsche even says their blood, their ancestry. You could come to the conclusion that he believes that perhaps only a healthy body should philosophize, right? And since he takes this level to groups of people or even whole races, one could conclude There are healthy races that have the ability to philosophize and weak or sickly races that don't. But I think when we look at a passage like this one, 120, we find that such an interpretation of Nietzsche's work would require that we adopt a Platonist, universalist, abstracted view of what health is, or what strength is, or what constitutes a healthy race, or a strong race, or the person or group that, quote-unquote, should philosophize, and the people and groups that shouldn't. So Nietzsche's point in calling metaphysics a symptom of bodies, his point there is that even our metaphysical ideas are not pulled out of the ether by a disinterested intellect. Our metaphysical ideas, our philosophy, that's also the result of these impulses and these predetermined valuations. And as we said before, even the most rarefied and abstract ideas, like those of Kant or Hegel, or even the contrived labyrinthine theology of someone like Aquinas, that seems to be so far removed from the root that Nietzsche sees, the physiology, but Nietzsche says no. Even that is the confession and autobiography of its author. It is the expression of a drive that has become tyrannical or a drive that is playing master. And so we would have to conclude that the constitution of that person, the makeup of their impulses, how they relate to one another, whether that's a healthy construction or an unhealthy one, the health of that person matters in terms of the kind of philosophy that they will create. Their philosophy is a direct result of that. The point is not only this type of person that I've designated is suited to do philosophy, only this type of body, only this type of health. He says here there are innumerable healths of the body. And I should say, it isn't really clear to me when Nietzsche's talking about groups or even when he invokes the term races, that he's talking about essential racial characteristics. In fact, I'm certain he's not talking about that. I just brought this passage up when I was speaking to Gnostic Informant, but Nietzsche has a great remark in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, where he says that philosophy never made us sick people healthy. It only makes healthy people healthier, or it makes sick people sicker. And so we might imagine that after a population has been domesticated for several generations, that's Nietzsche's terminology, right? After they've been tamed, after they've adopted, in concrete terms, a sedentary lifestyle and oriented their society around artistic and scientific output instead of military conquest, the philosophy they preach is going to be a reflection of that. So they will produce the sentiments that justify. So like John Glubb puts it this way, where he says, these cities in the late stage of empire begin to build walls around themselves. They begin to turn away from military campaigns. And they say, if you ask them, it's not that we're afraid to fight, it's that we consider it immoral. Now, whatever you think of the morality of dominating and conquesting, doing all those things, conquering, rather, the point is that it seems very clear from the history of human beings that we could make a general statement about human nature that when they have the power to do so, they'll go out and fight and conquer. It's pretty normal behavior. We could even say it's natural behavior. It's the over-domesticated man, as Nietzsche puts it, that, gets to a point where they start to come up with moral theories that say that's incorrect. And so it does raise the question as to whether or not that moral theory is just, well, to put it in Nietzsche's terms, a reflection of their declining energy, right? And so it's not that, why do I bring all of this up, right? Well, that's within a single society. That's within, Nietzsche would say within even 3 or 4 generations, an entire group of people can become sick, we might say. If you see that decline in energy, that decline in the strength of their impulses as a form of sickness, as what Nietzsche calls decadence, they will produce a decadent philosophy. But again, the interesting thing is that Nietzsche is not outright on the side of barbarian vitalist philosophy and outright against decadent philosophy, because for one thing, he admits that he himself is a decadent. He says, I fight against decadence, but I am still one of them, and the conflict between them is the driving force, the productive tension of all life. And you don't ever get away from that situation. The more important thing is that in this case, we're talking about the same group of people, right? So this is what's very different between Nietzsche's views on what we might call race or what we might call human beings at the group level, and the way like a racist or a racial essentialist would think about it, is that the character of a people, whether they're healthy or sick, is not some essential characteristic that's determined immutably. Again, within 3 or 4 generations, going from a nomadic warrior people to a sedentary domesticated people, that's the same group of people. So it wasn't any essential racial characteristic about them. It was the way that they were domesticated or tamed that takes them from perhaps doing a healthy philosophy to doing a sick philosophy. And one of the examples of this in Nietzsche's writing is, of course, the Greeks. He talks about the older Greekism versus the younger Greekism. Basically, the theoretical turn with Socrates. He sees the whole history of the Greeks as like a history of their decline. So does Nietzsche, is he making like a racial judgment on the Greeks as people by calling the later Greeks decadents? No, they're the same group of people racially as the early Greeks that he praises. And so this is a total sidetrack from the episode. I said I was just going to talk about this passage in context, but I think this passage has very important implications when Nietzsche talks about innumerable potential healths of the body, the relativity of health and sickness, the eternally recurrent nature of the struggle between health and sickness. You have to keep all of these things in mind, and people want to fit Nietzsche's philosophy into these really simple-minded boxes and categories of thought based on what they think is right and wrong according to their morality, which is the exact thing that Nietzsche criticizes. And so another thing in this passage, I guess another thing I need to bring up before we move on, denying the equality of human beings, right? Seeking after a standard that permits innumerable healths, that permits the unique and unparalleled. Perhaps most people ought not seek after that kind of thing, right? Perhaps it's better for the average person who has a strongly developed herd instinct to say, I'll stick with the moral doctrines that equivocates me with other people, but that treats me as a part of a group or a herd. It's all held to the same standard. It's expected to behave the same way, share the same goals, share the same virtues, share the same taboos, share the same vision of what health is, what constitutes health and what constitutes sickness. But for those of us who don't have a strongly developed herd instinct, which is not really up to you, right? But those of us who have an instinct to think individually, for those of us who have that perhaps monstrous aberration within ourselves that makes us individuals, we immoralists who get a thrill, a different kind of pleasure from going against the grain of the herd instinct, we should learn to appreciate differences and uniqueness because our entire orientation of the free spirit is on the side of the exception. It appreciates the exception. There are enough people who stand for the rule. Now, of course, the most beautiful exception arises as part of that contrast and tension with the rule, as is also the case with health and sickness. And it's also important that Nietzsche says the exception should never seek to become the rule. I mean, it would also be inappropriate for the great majority of people to follow our set of values. That's not workable. Those values are not meant for them. One man's health is not necessarily that of another, just like the values that would serve one person are not the same values that would serve another. So that's all the nuances and just incredible complexity to the ideas of Nietzsche that are brought out here or touched upon in this passage. Let's move on to 121. Quote, "Life, no argument. We have arranged for ourselves a world in which we can live by positing bodies, lines, planes, causes and effects, motion and rest, form and content. Without these articles of faith, nobody now could endure life. But that does not prove them. Life is no argument. The conditions of life might include error." End quote. In a way, this passage is simply a recapitulation to much of what we already discussed last episode and to some extent in this one. And we went into such depth in that episode that I'm going to gloss over this one a bit. But remember, lines, planes, bodies, and so on. Those are the mathematical fictions, the erroneous views of the world, indispensable to our perspective, which nevertheless always unfold into that seduction of being, the seduction to view the world in these Platonic terms, even though they're falsehoods, to treat them as objective truths. But I think this restatement of Nietzsche's position is helpful because it clarifies, especially the statement at the end, it clarifies when he says life is no argument. So the fact that an assertion is indispensable does not make it true. So when people say our society couldn't function if we if we abandon the idea of free will. That does not take you even 1 centimeter closer to a proof of free will. All that proves is that we're incentivized to believe in it even if it isn't true. And it might even be the case that the falsest judgments are the most indispensable to us, that we therefore hold on most fervently to the assertions which are most badly proven. And Nietzsche says at the end, the conditions of life might include error. So error might be inextricable from how we perceive the world. Again, we've explored this already, but that ought to greatly change the way that we evaluate error, the way that we understand this relationship between truth and error. As Nietzsche said in a previous passage, it may be the case that when beliefs about the world come into competition, it isn't a contest between truth and falsehood, but between two falsehoods. The competition is to determine which of the two is stronger than the other. And I touched on this before, but that's a very different consideration from, the discussion of myth or noble lies, just making things up because you think it might be life-affirming to believe in it. That's the way that people sometimes caricature Nietzsche. When he says these errors are indispensable, he means we quite literally can't dispense with them. You can't do it as an act of will. The converse of that proposition is that we can't instantiate them with an act of will either. So seeing the world in terms of bodies, that you see an object or a person or an animal or just a thing, and you say that's not trillions of particles. It's a thing, right? It's one thing. That isn't something you can decide to stop doing, that mental process that creates things. Even if you come to understand intellectually that the very notion of a body, separable from the broader environment, is a falsification of the world in some fundamental way. So many people hear these ideas of Nietzsche and they think it's a blank check to make things up because strength is more important than truth. I mean, the funny thing is, do you really need Nietzsche's permission to do that? No, you don't. But Nietzsche's point is that these ideas that are so strong that it doesn't matter whether they're true, he's not really talking about myths. He's talking about these ideas of lines, planes, causes and effects, form and content, motion and rest, etc. They're strong, quote unquote, in the relative sense that they dominate our minds and our perspective. They dominate the way we perceive and interpret the world. So again, even though this issue might be there in Nietzsche, it's not the same thing as, the noble lie of the Christian religion made us strong because then people were willing to die in the Crusades, right? Nietzsche does describe that phenomenon, that level of falsehood, but in this case, he's talking about something more fundamental. There is a deeper level of analysis than that. And that's when he's talking about untruths that could be a condition for life, or that the conditions of life include error. It's on that fundamental level of perception, the fact that our experience of reality is falsified even there. That's really what he's getting at. So it takes a while to penetrate to that level of analysis, I think, or it took me a while of reading Nietzsche to really comprehend that. Let's go to 122, quote, "Moral skepticism in Christianity. Christianity, too, has made a great contribution to the Enlightenment and taught moral skepticism very trenchantly and effectively, accusing and embittering men, yet with untiring patience and subtlety. It destroyed the faith in his virtues in every single individual. It led to the disappearance from the face of the earth all of those paragons of virtue, of whom there was no dearth in antiquity, those popular personalities who, imbued with faith in their own perfection, went about with the dignity of a great matador. When we today, trained in this Christian school of skepticism, read the moral treatises of the ancients, for example, Seneca and Epictetus, we have a diverting sense of superiority and feel full of secret insights and oversights. We feel as embarrassed as if a child were talking before an old man, or an overenthusiastic young beauty before La Rochefoucauld. We know better what virtue is. In the end, however, we have applied this same skepticism also to all religious states and processes, such as sin, repentance, grace, sanctification, and we have allowed the worm to dig so deep that now we have the same sense of subtle superiority and insight when we read any Christian book. We also know religious feelings better, and it is high time to know them well and to describe them well, for the pious people of the old faith are dying out too. Let us save their image and their type, at least, for knowledge." End quote. This is an incredible passage. Probably one of the better explanations, or I would say one of the more plausible explanations anyway, that Nietzsche gives for the death of God. It isn't just, Christianity promoted a will to truth, However, Nietzsche's position is sometimes, again, oversimplified and presented almost in caricature, right? It's not just Christianity promoted a will to truth and then people turn that will to truth against Christianity. It's that it promoted skepticism, but specifically he's talking about moral skepticism. So Christianity holds all mankind to be under the curse of original sin, which means there are no virtuous people, not truly virtuous people, right? There might be some who are, relative to other human beings, more virtuous, but Christianity is not relativism. It's absolutism. And no one is completely virtuous. No man is perfect. Nietzsche suggests that's rather foreign from the perspective of the ancients. They believed the truly noble man was perfect in some way. There could be beings who were without sin. And this is partly because, for example, in ancient Greece, or I think a large part of this is just that it doesn't matter as much what's in your heart as how you act and how you appear. So if in the eyes of all you're a great and virtuous man and your actions and your character speak to that, then you're a great and virtuous man. Who is to question you? Who's a lesser man to question what's in your heart, whether you harbor some secret fault or flaw or something like that? We might think of the extremes of this. I mean, people like Empedocles, who walked around saying there were gods on earth and, proclaiming themselves as such, or just simply, the prideful heroes and kings who were portrayed in the Greek tragedies and histories, who didn't feel they had to justify themselves and who felt a real sense of superiority. And I should say it was moral superiority because after all, the ancient aristocracies were established based on the assertion that they were divinely sanctioned, that they were sanctioned because of their virtue. And so Nietzsche then makes some funny remarks about old writers of moral maxims like Seneca and Epictetus, both Stoics, both late Stoics, and says that, listening to their insights is like listening to a child talking to an old man. Or he brings up La Rochefoucauld, which I think is a very intentional example to use, because La Rochefoucauld hung out in French salons and observed human social behavior. He wrote a compendium of moral maxims, he called them, based on what he learned about people. And he focuses on how self-love drives much of our actions, even if we try to present things otherwise. He focuses on the difference between what people present versus their true motives. And Jonathan Swift, that famous and very caustic Christian writer who attacked over-intellectualism and was in many ways an opponent of many of the trends of the Enlightenment, he has a little stanza of these verses that I quoted from in the episode on La Rochefoucauld, and I'll just paraphrase. He says, these unflattering assessments of human nature are not evidence of anything wrong with La Rochefoucauld, right? They indicate no corrupted mind in him. The fault is in mankind. So La Rochefoucauld, this great Renaissance intellectual, gets the sanction of a Christian moralist and anti-intellectual. Why? Because of La Rochefoucauld's moral skepticism. His willingness to inquire into the inner workings and drives and desires of others, be critical of the conscious explanations that they give. And so a pre-Christian writer could never match La Rochefoucauld when it comes to observing and understanding human beings. The scene that Nietzsche imagines, or he invites us to imagine, is an unsuspecting sort of over-enthusiastic young woman. And I think he brings this up because that's like the kind of person that La Rochefoucauld observed. And so, we imagine that kind of person trying to approach him and say, let me give you some of my own moral observations. And that we have the same sense of superiority that La Rochefoucauld would have felt in that situation when we as modern readers look over the work of Epictetus, right? Rather than Epictetus providing us with insights into the human condition, we find we're analyzing him. We're laughing at his pretenses to teach human beings the path to virtue because we now know no one attains virtue. Not in the absolute sense, really. We know that no human being, that what's going on the surface and however virtuous they might appear, their true motives are otherwise. We have that moral skepticism, of which La Rochefoucauld is a great example. And so why do we have that? Well, Christianity encourages us to remember that deep down in your heart of hearts, man isn't virtuous. Maybe he has thoughts and feelings that are less than virtuous, even if he doesn't act on them. And in Christianity, there are thought crimes, right? Failing to love God the way you're supposed to. Failing to do, or we might say, doing the right thing but for the wrong reasons. Those are sins, right? No man is free from sin. No one gets to pretend to be a paragon of virtue. There are only those who acknowledge their sin and those who don't, and it sort of becomes this competition for who can acknowledge the most guilt or be the most, own their sin most completely. And so through Christianity, humanity gains a faith that everyone who appears virtuous is not. And then we also know that our own virtue, even if others attribute virtue to us, is a farce, in the eyes of God anyway, right? We imagine this absolute spectator, this observer. And that God, the God of Christianity, pries into our inner life. It demands confession. It demands openness. It posits a God that looks into every feeling and thought. And it's worth noting that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where we meet the ugliest man, who is identified as the killer of God, one of his complaints is, God looked into my every nook and cranny. He saw every dirty, filthy part of my soul. I couldn't stand it. And so we could say, Christianity prompts us to investigate ourselves in our own inner life, to make ourselves profoundly self-conscious. And the purpose of this, the moral aim of this regime is to make us self-conscious of our faults. But Nietzsche says, this is why Christianity has made a great contribution to the Enlightenment. That part of the Enlightenment is the development of that moral skepticism. What is this contribution? That we can apply the same moral skepticism to the religion itself. In a way, we could say the moral skepticism of Christianity was directed against our impulses. It judges them, it evaluates them, it categorizes them. Now we can do the same thing with the impulses of Christianity. You might say, well, a religion doesn't have impulses. What we're talking about is the set of impulses privileged and valued and identified by Christianity. Remember, it's another herd table of values. It's another order of rank of values, which is really a rank ordering of impulses and their worth. So this is exactly what Nietzsche's project does, is to investigate the impulses of Christianity. And next week, when we get into some of these later aphorisms, that's what he's doing in this section. So it isn't precisely that Nietzsche applies the will to truth to Christianity in the sense of discovering that religious claims aren't as real as objective scientific claims. That's not really Nietzsche. You should have been able to gather by now that that's not really Nietzsche's focus. It's that Christianity gives us a will to truth in regard to ourselves and our own morality. And it gives us this demand to be introspective and self-conscious and ask ourselves, what am I really serving? What intention does this action flow out of? What value am I following or chasing after? And so on. And so now that this moral skepticism is well developed, we can apply it to the religion. It's now a faculty we possess. We can apply it to the religious state of mind. We can apply it to religious processes. Sin, repentance, grace, sanctification are the examples Nietzsche gives. And we can ask, what is really going on during that state of mind? Why is the doctrine of sin so powerful? What is it based on? Why would such a thing develop, right? We can ask all of these questions. And Nietzsche carries this out in earnest in the genealogy of morals. And interestingly, he already seems to anticipate the death of God here. He's brought it up at the beginning of the book, right? But he says, the pious people of the old faith are dying out. Let's save their type, at least for knowledge. And that sentence is, I think, intended to be funny. We're saving them, not in the way Jesus saves, but in the way a scientist saves a sample to analyze. All right, let's go to number 123. Quote, knowledge as more than a mere means. Without this new passion, the passion to know, science would still be promoted. After all, science has grown and matured without it until now. The good faith in science, the prejudice in its favor that dominates the modern state and formerly dominated even the church, is actually based on the fact that this unconditional urge and passion has manifested itself so rarely, and that science is considered not a passion, but a mere condition or an ethos, often mere amour plaisir of knowledge, curiosity, is felt to be quite sufficient, or amour vanité, being accustomed to it with the ulterior motive of honors and sustenance. For many people, it is actually quite enough that they have too much leisure and do not know what to do with it except to read, collect, arrange, observe, and recount. Their scientific impulse is their boredom. Pope Leo X once sang the praises of science in his brief to Borealdo. He called it the most beautiful ornament and the happiest pride of our life, and a noble occupation in times of happiness as well as unhappiness. And finally he said, without it, all human endeavors would lack any firm foothold, and even with it, things are changeable and insecure enough. But this tolerably skeptical pope keeps silent, like all other ecclesiastical eulogists of science, about his ultimate judgment. From his words, one might infer, although this is strange enough for such a friend of the arts, that he places science above art. But in the end, it is nothing but good manners when he does not speak at this point of what he places high above all the sciences too: revealed truth and the eternal salvation of the soul. Compared to that, what are ornaments, pride, entertainment, and the security of life to him? Science is something second class, not anything ultimate, unconditional, not an object of passion. This judgment Leo retained in his soul, the truly Christian judgment about science. In antiquity, the dignity and recognition of science were diminished by the fact that even her most zealous disciples placed the striving for virtue first, and one felt that knowledge had received the highest praise when one celebrated it as the best means to virtue. It is something new in history that knowledge wants to be more than a mere means." End quote. So the context around Pope Leo X's directive to Filippo Borealdo is this. The Pope had just acquired the manuscript of the Annals by Tacitus, which had not been previously published, and he entrusted this manuscript to Borealdo, and Pope Leo wanted him to correct the text and prepare it to be printed because he wanted to make available a complete edition of this masterwork of antiquity to the entire world. But Tacitus is, of course, a pre-Christian pagan. This is not a holy text. It's not a Christian text. If the Pope's goal was to foster the education of the world, it's not an education that leads to salvation, right? And even the Pope feels in his brief to Borealdo that he has to justify the time and effort he's spending on Tacitus. And the justification he gives is what Nietzsche cites in this passage, that knowledge itself is a good, the promotion of literature and the arts, these are good things. Pope Leo says in his brief that nothing more excellent has been given to mankind by the Creator than the ability to enjoy knowledge and to ornament himself with knowledge, guide himself with knowledge. And after all, knowledge is useful in every situation. It consoles us in times of adversity and so on. Keep in mind, Pope Leo reigns during the early 1500s, the time of the Renaissance in Italy, so there was already something of a shift in the European mentality that allowed for a bit more liberality in what, people could be encouraged to study. So, as Nietzsche puts it, the Pope sings the praises of science, and he calls him a tolerably skeptical Pope, but nevertheless, his ultimate judgment had to have been, to the extent that he was a Christian, in fact, the head of the Catholic Church, that revealed truth is always higher than science. Ornamenting and guiding your life, consoling yourself during hard times, that's all well and good, but what is that compared to the salvation of your soul? And so setting the specific example of Pope Leo X to one side, the real meat of this passage here that Nietzsche is pointing to is the character of the ultimate and truly Christian judgment about the value of science. And that is, its value is nil, right? Science is, after all, the study of the physical world. Empiricism focuses on the world of the senses. But that world is of no value to the Christian. This is a sin-cursed world ruled by Satan. The pious man looks beyond the world. He looks beyond the horizons of the earthly. So in the same way that no man is truly virtuous under Christianity, no human pursuit or physical pursuit or aesthetic pursuit or even scientific pursuit can really be said to be worthwhile in the final analysis. Whatever praise that Christians heap upon the sciences, Scripture is always higher than experiment. Revelation is always higher than reason. In the final analysis, to say it's higher than or better than is probably not even extreme enough. To say revelation is better than reason, right, or salvation is better than science, that is not extreme enough of a statement, because no amount of knowledge will ever lead you to salvation. It never accumulates to that, and it doesn't technically even help with it. It's worthless. From a truly pure Christian perspective, it's worthless. But then Nietzsche goes further. Even in the world of antiquity, the opposing values set, right? Dionysus versus the crucified. Well, in that world, science isn't really valuable in and of itself there either. In the ancient world, virtue counted above knowledge. And knowledge only attains honors, attains prestige, when it's seen as a means to virtue. So the message of Socrates, right? Reason leads to virtue, which leads to eudaimonia. That's how wisdom, reason, knowledge, philosophy, science, whatever we want to call it, that's how that begins to look respectable and valuable, is with Socrates making that turn. Reason and philosophy were never seen that way before Socrates. After Socrates, the whole culture changes. Plato founds the academy, and Plato teaches Aristotle, and you know the rest. So to return to the themes at the beginning of the passage, therefore, which Nietzsche revisits at the end when he says, quote, "It's something new in history that knowledge wants to be more than a mere means," end quote. It's remarkable that science has advanced the way it has, in spite of the fact that it's never been something valuable unto itself, we might say. The impulse to do science, right? In that rank ordering of impulses that all the herd moralities make, it would be lowly ranked by all of them, right? The urge, the drive to be scientific, the idea of deriving pleasure from scientific inquiry, deriving pleasure simply from acquiring knowledge, this is all relatively new. And yet science has advanced in spite of this, right? That's what Nietzsche says. It's never had those cultural valuations on its side promoting it. So now imagine how much farther we could take our scientific inquiry now if we see knowledge as a good unto itself. Not even the Greeks had this. This is something we only gain after we overcome Christianity. Potentially, this could be a new form of health. And it's a new form, right? Because it's not even conceivable before the self-consciousness and moral skepticism promoted by the Christian religion, which is part and parcel with Christianity's sickness. So by overcoming this, right, we create a new image of health. And Nietzsche himself might imagine that he's the type of person who could enjoy knowledge as a value unto itself. And he says this later in the book. He'll explicitly say that a great liberator for him is to see life as a means to knowledge. We're going to look at one final aphorism. This happens to end on a concluding note, so it's perfect for dividing up these episodes. Nietzsche is preparing us for a sea change, we might say. Quote, this is 124, quote, "In the horizon of the infinite, we have left the land and have embarked. We have burned our bridges behind us. Indeed, we have gone farther and destroyed the land behind us. Now, little ship, look out. Beside you is the ocean. To be sure, it does not always roar, and at times it lies spread out like silk and gold and reveries of graciousness. But hours will come when you realize that it is infinite, and that there is nothing more awesome than infinity. Oh, the poor bird that felt free and now strikes the walls of this cage. Woe, when you feel homesick for the land, as if it had offered more freedom, and there is no longer any land." End quote. The metaphor of the sea and of embarking on a great sea voyage is often invoked in the gay science, mainly in these Book 3 and onward, because it was at least partially written in Genoa, which is the city from which Columbus embarked on his journey across a vast sea and discovered an entire new world, so to speak. And so that's what Nietzsche dreams of doing philosophically, and I think it's no accident that he invokes the metaphor of embarking on these sea voyages, specifically when he's walking the streets of Genoa and writing this book. The dry land that we cling to, in contrast to that infinite sea, invokes that notion of the infinity of the flux that Nietzsche sees as the Heraclitean becoming of reality, the true chaos of reality. I mean, even that's a falsification, but this is the closest we get to describing it with these inadequate words, right? That's his image of the real reality. He intuits that such a thing is the only thing that remains over if we were to somehow dispense with all our anchoring, life-affirming errors. So we get rid of lines, planes, bodies, cause and effect, motion and rest, form and content. Now, perhaps we cannot truly get rid of those in how we perceive and experience the world. But suppose we were to begin to think of the world in those terms. If we were to risk the experiment of thinking about a world beyond lines, planes, and bodies, and cause and effect, and so on, what do we have before us? Well, all we have is the infinite yawning before us. And we might say, in the face of this, what might come to mind? Well, maybe, whither are we moving? Is there still any up or down? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? If you recognize any of those lines, I took those from the Madman passage, where Nietzsche revisits the idea of the death of God and treats the death of God as a potentially terrifying thing. And the Madman passage, by the way, is the very next aphorism, and we're going to start out next week by talking about it. But this passage here, 124, it can be seen as a preparation for that. We just sailed out into the wide infinite sea of possibilities, and in the next aphorism, Nietzsche hits us with the terror that such an adventure could inspire. And the metaphor of the bird that thinks he's free and then hits the wall of his cage. It's sort of compared to, you think you're free by sailing out from dry land, but now you're confined to this boat, embarking upon the infinite, upon infinite seas. And again, just to really drive this point home, line, form, cause and effect, bodies, substance, number. These are life-affirming indispensable errors, but they're precisely what Nietzsche identifies with the shadow of God. He raised that possibility at the beginning of Book 3 of vanquishing that shadow. And so we might ask, what happens when we vanquish that shadow? Supposing such a thing is even possible. Well, we become truly unmoored. We leave the modernist view of truth, the objective view of reality. We're no longer anchored either by revealed truth or by scientific positivism, or these attempts to cling on to the real in the style of Kant, to reconstruct the real or the moral or the metaphysical in the wake of the death of God. Because the objective reality that such a worldview tries to hold on to is another shadow of God. So what's truly beyond that shadow? And you would have to almost seem mad to talk about that possibility. And that's why Nietzsche puts the next aphorism into the mouth of the madman. But that's all for next week. I hope you'll join me then in trying to wash away the blood from our hands as the killers of God. And maybe you'll stick around long enough to raise a temple and sepulcher for the old God while you're here. Until then, keep on sailing. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.